You think you know about medieval cruelty. Think you've heard the worst stories about Dracula. Well, buckle up, because the real Vlad the Impaler was so much worse than any vampire movie could ever show you. We're talking about a man who didn't just kill his enemies. He systematically tortured and murdered their wives and families in ways so horrific that even hardened medieval soldiers would vomit at the sight. This isn't some Hollywood fantasy. This is the true story of a 15th century ruler who turned psychological warfare into an art form of absolute terror. A man who created literal forests of impaled bodies. He was a ruler whose name still makes people shudder 500 years after his death. You're about to discover the shocking truths about what Vlad the Impaler did specifically to his enemies' wives. The women who became victims of his twisted sense of justice and revenge. From forced cannibalism to mass drownings, from burning people alive to displays of corpses that stretched for miles. These are the facts that history books barely mention because they're too disturbing to teach in schools. History classes don't tell you about the thousands of women who suffered unimaginable torments just because their husbands opposed this madman. But today, I'm going to expose the horrifying reality of medieval warfare's darkest chapter. Trust me, by the end of this, you'll understand why Vlad's legend became the inspiration for the most terrifying vampire in literature. This isn't just history, this is horror. Let's dive into the nightmare. Number 1, the cannibal feasts, breaking minds before bodies. Let's start with the most psychologically disturbing thing Vlad the Impaler did to his enemies' wives. This wasn't just about killing. This was about destroying the human spirit itself before ending their lives. Vlad had a special torture designed specifically for the wives of his captured enemies. First, he would impale the husband right in front of his wife. But here's where it gets truly horrifying. He wouldn't let the wife die quickly. Instead, Vlad would force these women to participate in what can only be described as the most nightmarish dinner party in human history. Historical records from German pamphlets of the 1480s describe how Vlad would have his soldiers cut pieces of flesh from the impaled husbands while they were still dying. Then, and this is where it becomes absolutely unbearable, he would force the wives to cook and eat their own husband's flesh. We're talking about women being compelled to commit cannibalism on the men they loved, while those men were still barely alive on stakes nearby. Think about the psychological torture of that for a second. You're watching your husband dying in agony on a stake. Then soldiers hand you his flesh and tell you to eat it, or they'll do worse to your children. This wasn't quick medieval brutality. This was calculated, systematic destruction of the human psyche. Modern psychologists who study torture methods say that forcing someone to cannibalize a loved one is one of the most effective ways to completely break the human mind. Vlad figured this out 500 years before modern psychology even existed. The man was a genius of suffering. But here's what makes it even more terrifying. This wasn't a one-time thing. Multiple historical sources from different countries describe Vlad organizing these forced cannibal feasts on multiple occasions. German manuscripts, Turkish chronicles, and Russian narratives all mention variations of this practice. That means this happened again and again to dozens, maybe hundreds of women. You don't learn this in history classes, but some surviving accounts suggest that after these women were forced to eat their husbands, Vlad would then have them impale themselves right next to their husbands' bodies. The psychological trauma was just the appetizer. The physical death was the main course. But that's nothing compared to what he did on a mass scale. Number 2, the forest of the impaled, 20,000 bodies on display. Now let's talk about Vlad's most infamous creation, something so horrific that Ottoman soldiers, men who had seen countless battlefields, literally turned around and went home rather than face it. In 1462, when Sultan Mehmed II invaded Wallachia with an army of 90,000 soldiers, he expected to crush Vlad easily. Instead, as the Ottoman army approached the capital city of Targovist, they encountered something that would haunt their nightmares forever. Picture this, an entire forest of impaled bodies. Not dozens, not hundreds. Historical records specifically state approximately 20,000 to 23,000 impaled corpses, arranged in perfect geometric rows stretching for miles. And here's the crucial detail everyone misses. A huge percentage of these weren't soldiers. They were women, the wives, mothers, daughters, and sisters of Vlad's enemies. Turkish chronicler Chalcondyles wrote that the sight was so overwhelming that birds would not dare fly over the area because of the stench. We're talking about rotting human bodies creating such a powerful smell that it could be detected from miles away. Modern estimates suggest this forest covered an area of roughly 3 square kilometers. But here's where it gets even more disturbing. Vlad didn't just randomly impale people. He organized them by social status. The wives of nobles were impaled higher and dressed in their finest clothes. The wives of common soldiers were impaled lower. Even in death, Vlad maintained a twisted hierarchy. You don't learn this in schools, but Ottoman records describe how Sultan Mehmed II himself, a man who had conquered Constantinople and slaughtered thousands, actually vomited when he saw this display. Think about that for a second. A hardened military conqueror who had personally ordered countless executions was so disgusted by what Vlad had done that he physically got sick. Some of these women had been impaled for days or even weeks before the Ottoman army arrived. The impalement method Vlad used was specifically designed to keep victims alive as long as possible. The stake was carefully inserted to avoid major organs, meaning some people could survive for hours or even days in absolute agony. Imagine being one of the Ottoman soldiers who had a wife back home. You march with your army expecting a normal battle, and instead, you see thousands of women impaled, many still barely alive, moaning in agony. Several Ottoman accounts claim that thousands of soldiers deserted immediately after seeing this. They literally walked away from their army and went home. But wait, it gets worse. Sultan maimed Ai, despite having a massive army, actually retreated. He turned around and left Wallachia because he couldn't mentally handle facing a man who would do this. Vlad's psychological warfare worked perfectly. Historical records indicate that Vlad specifically targeted enemies' wives for these mass displays because he knew it would have maximum psychological impact. He wasn't just killing people, he was sending a message written in blood and rotting flesh. But Vlad's obsession with punishing women went even deeper. Number 3, the purity punishments. Vlad's twisted moral code. Here's where Vlad the Impaler's mind becomes truly fascinating and absolutely terrifying. This man had a bizarre obsession with what he called moral purity, especially when it came to women's sexuality, and the punishments he devised for those who broke his moral code were straight out of a horror movie. Vlad believed he was personally responsible for maintaining moral order in his kingdom, but his definition of morality was psychotic. If any woman, including the wives of his captured enemies, was even suspected of adultery or infidelity, Vlad had a specific punishment designed for them. Multiple historical sources, including German pamphlets and Wallachian chronicles, describe how Vlad would have women's sexual organs cut out. But that wasn't the end. He would then impale them from that exact spot upward through their bodies until the stake came out through their mouths. This was his twisted idea of purification. Think about the symbolism Vlad was going for here. He saw women's sexuality as the source of moral corruption, so he literally destroyed that part of them and used it as the entry point for execution. This wasn't just killing. This was making a statement with every single victim's body. Here's something that will blow your mind. Vlad applied this punishment even to the wives of his enemies, women he'd captured from foreign lands. One documented case from 1462 describes how Vlad captured a group of Turkish officials traveling with their wives. He interrogated the women about their marriages, and if he determined any had been unfaithful by his insane standards, he would order this specific form of execution. Modern historians examining these accounts estimate that hundreds of women died this way during Vlad's various reigns. We're talking about a systematic practice, not random acts of violence. You don't learn this in history classes, but Vlad actually believed he was doing God's work with these punishments. He saw himself as a divine instrument of justice, cleansing the world of moral corruption. German manuscripts quote him as saying these executions were necessary for the moral health of his kingdom. But here's what makes it absolutely insane. Vlad would sometimes have these executions performed in town squares, forcing entire communities to watch. Women and children were required to witness these brutal deaths as educational examples. Imagine living in a place where you could be executed in the most horrific way imaginable, based on one man's twisted interpretation of morality. Several historical accounts describe how Vlad specifically targeted the wives of boyars, nobles who opposed him. If a nobleman spoke against Vlad in court, There was a chance that days later his wife would be accused of some moral crime and subjected to these horrific punishments. It was political intimidation wrapped in religious justification. The psychological impact on communities was devastating. Women lived in constant terror, knowing that any accusation, real or fabricated, could lead to the most painful death imaginable. Vlad had created a society where fear was the primary method of control. But Vlad's methods of mass killing were even more horrific. Number 4, the burning barns, cleansing through fire. Now, we need to talk about one of Vlad's favorite mass execution methods, and how he specifically used it against the families of his enemies, particularly women and children. When Vlad conquered a village or a town that had supported his enemies, he had a specific protocol. He would separate the men from the women and children. The men would usually be impaled, but the women and children, they got something arguably worse. Historical records from Wallachian and Hungarian sources describe how Vlad would order all the women and children rounded up and locked inside wooden barns or churches. Then his soldiers would board up all the doors and windows, and then they would set the entire structure on fire. We're not talking about quick deaths. Wooden buildings filled with hundreds of people don't burn fast. Modern fire investigators estimate it would take 15-30 minutes for everyone inside to die from either burns or smoke inhalation. That's half an hour of absolute hell, screaming, crushing, burning alive while your children die around you. One particularly detailed account from a German manuscript describes an incident in 1459 near the town of Brasov. Vlad's forces had captured a village where some merchants had been trading with his enemies. He ordered approximately 500 women and children locked inside the village's largest barn. Then he personally watched as his soldiers set it on fire. But here's the truly sick part. Vlad reportedly called this cleansing through fire. He believed he was purifying the land of the taint of those who had opposed him. To him, this wasn't murder. It was spiritual cleansing. Multiple sources indicate that Vlad used this method repeatedly throughout his reign. Estimates suggest that thousands of women and children died this way, burned alive as collective punishment for their husbands' and fathers' political choices. Think about the mindset required to do this. You've captured a village. The women and children there had zero control over whether their men supported you or your enemies. But you decide to burn them all alive anyway, not for any crime they committed, but as a message to others. Turkish records from the period described finding the remains of these burned structures during later campaigns. They reported finding piles of charred bones so thick that the ruins couldn't be entered. In some cases, villages were so completely destroyed that they were never rebuilt. Even 50 years later, travelers would avoid these places because they believed the ghosts of the burned victims still haunted them. You don't learn this in history classes, but Vlad sometimes forced people from neighboring villages to watch these burnings. He would make entire communities witness these mass executions as a warning about what happened if you opposed him. Imagine being forced to watch hundreds of women and children burning alive, knowing that if your village was next, your family would be screaming in those flames. One particularly chilling account describes how after one of these burnings, Vlad had dinner served to him while sitting near the still smoking ruins. He ate calmly while the smell of burned human flesh filled the air. Several witnesses described this incident, all mentioning how disturbing it was that Vlad showed absolutely no emotion while dining near mass graves of women and children he just murdered. But Vlad had another method that was just as brutal. Number 5, the drowning campaigns, erasing bloodlines. Here's a method of execution that doesn't get talked about enough, but it reveals just how strategically Vlad thought about destroying his enemies. He didn't just want to kill people. He wanted to completely erase entire family lines from existence. Wallachian chronicles and some Romanian historical texts describe how Vlad would order mass drownings, specifically targeting the wives and daughters of his rivals. But this wasn't just about killing. This was about genocide. Vlad wanted to ensure that his enemies' bloodlines ended completely. The method was brutally simple. Women captured from enemy families would be tied together in groups, sometimes dozens at a time, and thrown into rivers. But here's the detail that makes it even more horrific. Vlad specifically ordered these drownings to happen in winter when the rivers were partially frozen. Imagine being tied to 20 other women, then thrown into a freezing river in the middle of winter. You're not just drowning, you're experiencing hypothermia at the same time. Your body is shutting down from the cold, even as your lungs fill with ice-cold water. Medieval medical texts suggest it could take 10 to 15 minutes to die this way. Every second, pure agony. One particularly well-documented incident occurred in 1460, near the Arges River. Vlad had captured a group of boyar families who had supported a rival claimant to the throne. Historical accounts state that he had approximately 200 women and children drowned in a single day. The chronicler specifically mentions that the river ran red with their clothes and that bodies were found downstream for weeks afterward. But here's what makes this particularly strategic and evil. By specifically targeting women of childbearing age and young girls, Vlad was ensuring that these noble families couldn't continue. He was committing what we would today call targeted genocide. Modern historians examining Vlad's military campaigns have identified at least 5 major drowning incidents where hundreds of women died. These weren't spontaneous acts of violence. They were planned operations with specific political goals. You don't learn this in schools, but some accounts suggest that Vlad would sometimes make the male prisoners watch these drownings before executing them as well. Fathers watching their daughters drown. Husbands watching their wives and children thrown into frozen rivers. The psychological torture was just as important to Vlad as the physical killing. Turkish chronicles describe discovering the aftermath of one of these drowning sites months later. They reported finding so many skeletal remains along one stretch of river that soldiers were afraid to camp nearby, believing the place was cursed. One horrifying detail from a Moldavian chronicle describes how in some cases Vlad would have weights attached to some women, but not others. This meant that some would sink immediately, while others would struggle and thrash at the surface for several minutes before finally going under. The women who drowned quickly actually got the merciful death. But even after death, Vlad found ways to use his victims. Number 6, the death marches, punishment roads. Let's talk about one of Vlad's most insidious methods of killing: the forced marches that turned roads into mass graveyards. When Vlad captured enemy territories, he didn't always execute people immediately. Instead, he had a more drawn-out torture method, specifically designed for the families of his enemies. He would force entire groups of women and children to march for days or weeks, deliberately providing no food, minimal water, and no rest stops. Multiple historical sources describe these death marches. Hungarian records from 1462 mention encountering roads where bodies were scattered like fallen leaves, the corpses of women who had collapsed from exhaustion, starvation, and dehydration during these forced marches. Here's how brutal this was. Imagine walking for 15, 20 hours a day with no food, carrying perhaps a small child or elderly relative. The moment you collapse, you're left where you fall. No burial, no mercy, just death by the roadside while the column keeps moving. One particularly detailed account from a Saxon merchant describes encountering one of these march routes in 1461. He reported that for a stretch of nearly 50 kilometers, there were bodies visible from the road every few hundred paces. Modern historians estimate that thousands of women and children died this way. But here's the truly calculated evil of this method. Vlad left the bodies unburied deliberately. They served as warnings to anyone traveling those roads. Every corpse was a message. This is what happens if you oppose me. Some accounts describe how these marches would last 7 to 10 days, covering hundreds of kilometers. Women would be forced to march from captured territories back toward Vlad's heartland. By the time the surviving ones reached their destination, many were so weak they died within days anyway. Turkish military reports from the period mentioned discovering these punishment roads. One Ottoman officer wrote that his soldiers found a road where they could track the march's progress by the increasing density of bodies, showing that more people died each day as exhaustion and starvation accumulated. You don't learn this in history classes, but some accounts suggest that Vlad specifically designed these marches to pass through territories where his enemies had support. He was using the suffering of captured women as mobile propaganda, showing everyone along the route what happened to families that stood against him. One particularly chilling detail from Romanian folklore, which often preserves historical truths, describes how villagers along these routes were forbidden from helping the marching women. If anyone gave food or water to the prisoners, their entire family would be added to the march. So locals had to watch these columns of dying women and children pass through their villages, unable to help without condemning their own families. Several accounts mention that some women killed their own children during these marches, rather than watch them die slowly of starvation. That's the level of desperation Vlad's methods created, mothers choosing murder over letting their children suffer. But perhaps Vlad's most disturbing habit was what he did with corpses after execution. Number 7, dining with the dead, the ultimate terror display. Now we come to what might be the most psychologically disturbing thing about Vlad the Impaler, his relationship with corpses, and how he used the bodies of executed women as both decoration and propaganda. Multiple historical sources, including German pamphlets, Turkish chronicles, and Hungarian records, all describe the same disturbing habit. Vlad would display the corpses of executed women along all major roads leading to his castles and capitals. But that's just the beginning of this nightmare. The impaled bodies weren't just random displays. They were carefully arranged. According to several accounts, Vlad would have the bodies of enemies' wives positioned at specific intervals along roads, close enough that travelers would always have at least one decomposing corpse in view, no matter where they were on the journey. Think about traveling in medieval times. You're walking or riding for days through Wallachia, and the entire time, from the moment you enter Vlad's territory until you reach your destination, you're surrounded by rotting corpses of women impaled on stakes. The smell alone would be unbearable, but the psychological impact absolutely devastating. One German pamphlet from 1463 describes a merchant's journey to Vlad's court. The merchant reported that for the final 30 kilometers before reaching the castle, there were impaled bodies as far as the eye could see in every direction. He specifically mentions that many appeared to be women and children, and that birds and wild animals had fed on the corpses, creating scenes of absolute horror. But here's where Vlad's behavior becomes truly incomprehensible. Multiple sources describe him having meals served outdoors among these corpses. We're talking about Vlad sitting at a table eating dinner, while surrounded by dozens of decomposing bodies of people he'd ordered killed. One Turkish chronicle describes an incident where Vlad invited captured Ottoman officials to dine with him. The meal was served in a field where hundreds of impaled prisoners were slowly dying or already dead. When the Turkish officials complained about the smell, Vlad reportedly laughed and said they should be honored to dine in the company of brave warriors. Modern psychologists who study serial killers say that this behavior indicates a complete lack of empathy and a personality disorder of massive proportions. But Vlad wasn't a serial killer in the traditional sense. He was a ruler with absolute power, which meant his psychological disorders could be expressed on a massive, state-sponsored scale. You don't learn this in history classes, but some accounts suggest that Vlad would specifically have the bodies of high-status women, wives of nobles, and wealthy merchants impaled near his dining areas. This wasn't random, it was strategic humiliation. He was showing that even the most respected women from enemy families were just rotting meat to him. One particularly disturbing account from a Wallachian boyar describes a feast at Vlad's court in 1460. The boyar mentions that the smell from nearby impaled corpses was so strong that several guests vomited during the meal. Vlad reportedly became angry and had one of the guests who vomited impaled the next day for insulting the dining arrangements. Several sources mention that Vlad would sometimes keep bodies on display for weeks or even months in medieval summer heat. You can imagine the state of decomposition. We're talking about bodies that were barely recognizable as human anymore, just masses of rotting flesh held up by stakes, covered in insects, and picked apart by carrion birds. But here's what makes this truly terrifying. This wasn't the behavior of a madman who didn't understand what he was doing. Multiple historical accounts describe Vlad as being calm, rational, and articulate while surrounded by these horrors. He would discuss politics, negotiate treaties, and conduct normal business while literally sitting in a field of rotting corpses. One account describes how a visiting diplomat from Hungary asked Vlad why he kept so many bodies on display. Vlad reportedly answered that they were reminders both for his enemies of what awaited them and for his own people of why they should remain loyal. He saw the corpse forests as practical political tools, not as the acts of a monster. The psychological warfare aspect of this display method was incredibly effective. Word spread throughout Eastern Europe about Vlad's corpse-lined roads. Merchants would take longer routes to avoid traveling through Wallachia. Diplomats would request meetings in neutral territories because they didn't want to visit Vlad's domain. Even enemy armies would sometimes refuse to invade because soldiers had heard about the horrors that awaited them. Think about how effective this strategy was. Vlad controlled a relatively small territory with limited resources, but by creating such extreme terror, he made his land seem more dangerous than it actually was. The corpse displays were force multipliers. They made his power seem much greater than it really was, because people assumed anyone willing to do this must be nearly invincible. But here's the final horrifying detail. When Vlad himself was finally killed in battle in 1476, some accounts suggest that his body was treated similarly to how he had treated his victims. His head was reportedly cut off and sent to the Ottoman Sultan in Constantinople, where it was displayed on a stake, the same method Vlad had used on thousands of his enemies' wives and families. In a twisted way, Vlad's final fate was poetic justice. The man who had created forests of impaled corpses ended up as a displayed corpse himself. So there you have it, the 7 most horrific things Vlad the Impaler did specifically to his enemies' wives. Forced cannibalism, mass impalement displays stretching for miles, twisted purity punishments, burning hundreds alive in locked barns, mass drownings in frozen rivers, Death marches that turned roads into graveyards and corpse displays that traumatized an entire region. These aren't exaggerations or legends. These are documented historical facts from multiple independent sources across different countries and cultures. Vlad the Impaler was real, and the horrors he inflicted on women, particularly the wives of his enemies, were worse than any vampire story could ever capture. By the end of this, you should understand why Vlad's legacy terrified Europe for centuries, why Bram Stoker chose him as the inspiration for Dracula, why even 500 years later, his name still represents ultimate evil. This wasn't just a cruel ruler. This was a man who turned torture and terror into a science, who understood psychology before psychology existed as a field, who knew that the most effective way to defeat enemies wasn't just to kill them, but to destroy their families, erase their bloodlines, and create such horror that the mere mention of his name would make people surrender. If these disturbing historical facts shocked you, hit that subscribe button because history is full of horrors that textbooks conveniently leave out. Trust me, there are plenty more nightmare-inducing truths waiting to be uncovered. Remember, vampires aren't real, but Vlad the Impaler was. And that's so much more terrifying